Dan, a man known for his love of women, lived in a small village. He was incredibly wealthy. His riches were famous far and wide. Yet, more than his wealth, what Dan cherished most was women. He had a generous heart, and every woman in the village knew it. Whenever Dan set his eyes on a woman he admired, he showered her with gifts, money, anything she desired. And because he was so wealthy, women gravitated toward him effortlessly. They smiled, followed, and Dan welcomed them with open arms. Dan eventually married a striking woman named Adaku. Unlike the others, Adaku was different, strong-willed and unyielding. In the entire village, no one dared to challenge her. When angered, her eyes burned with intensity, and her words cut like a blade. But none of this mattered to Dan. He adored his wife. Together, they built a family, and Adaku took charge of their home. Though Dan's affections often drifted toward other women, Adaku remained by his side, watching, waiting. The villagers knew well that Dan's love came with consequences, for Adaku was not a woman to be trifled with. Dan's life was a blend of wealth and women, but he was unaware that trouble loomed ahead. Though Adaku loved him deeply, her love burned with intensity. She despised his wandering eyes, and each time she caught him speaking to another woman, fury twisted her face. Adaku didn't care who it was. If a woman got too close to Dan, she would fight, scream, and send them running. Even though she had children with Dan, her heart remained restless. She loved him deeply, but his endless pursuit of other women made her feel as if the ground beneath her was constantly shifting. Dan's gaze was always wandering, always searching for the next woman, and it fueled Adaku's fury. Then one day, Dan came home with news that shattered Adaku's world. He had taken another wife. Her name was Aote, and she was breathtakingly beautiful. Dan couldn't resist her. Aote had flawless skin, a quiet smile, and eyes that shimmered, like the moon. But to Adaku, she was nothing more than a thorn in her side. From that moment, trouble erupted in Dan's home. Adaku's heart burned with jealousy, and Aote became her primary target. The once peaceful household turned into a battleground of tension and rage. The storm that would lead to Dan's downfall had only just begun. Aote was gentle, soft-spoken, and graceful. She never sought conflict, but Adaku didn't care. The moment Aote stepped into their home, Adaku's anger flared like an uncontrollable wildfire. She despised Aote's presence and made sure she suffered for it every single day. "Go and sweep the house," Adaku would command, her piercing eyes fixed on Aote. Silently, Aote would obey, sweeping every corner while Adaku's children watched and laughed at her. "Fetch water," Adaku's voice would ring out again and again. With no other choice, Aote would pick up the heavy water pot and walk to the stream, her feet dragging with exhaustion. As she toiled, Adaku's children played, mocking the stepmother who was forced to do all the work. Aote couldn't take it anymore. Desperate, she turned to Dan, hoping for protection. But Dan was indifferent. His thoughts were already on the next woman he could marry. He barely listened to Aote's pleas. "I'll talk to her," he would say dismissively. But his words meant nothing. He never did. And so Aote endured. Each day, Adaku made her life more unbearable, and there was no escape. She worked, she suffered, and no one came to her rescue. Meanwhile, Dan's eyes never rested. Even with Adaku and Aote in his home, Dan's desire for women only grew stronger. One day, while visiting town, he met another woman. Her name was Neka. Unlike the village women, Neka was young, with flawless skin, bright eyes, and a smile that could stop anyone in their tracks. Dan was captivated. Without a second thought, he married her. But Neka was different from his other wives. She didn't marry Dan for love, she saw only his wealth. In her heart, she thought, "This old man won't last long. When he dies, I'll take everything and leave this village forever." The moment Neka moved into the household, the fragile peace that remained shattered completely. Adaku, once the undisputed ruler of the home, felt threatened. Aote, who had already suffered in silence, now had to deal with Neka's defiance. Unlike Aote, who quietly obeyed Adaku's commands, Neka refused to be controlled. Neka was fearless. She had no respect for Adaku or Aote. Adaku's fiery temper and harsh words did nothing to shake her. She refused to do any chores, making it clear that she was in charge. Even Adaku's children were not spared. "Go fetch water for me," Neka would demand, and the children had no choice but to obey. Not even Adaku's sharp words could stop Neka from doing as she pleased. As always, Dan remained indifferent. Blinded by Neka's beauty, he gave her whatever she wanted. Adaku and Aote's complaints meant nothing to him. With Neka's arrival, the house became a boiling pot of anger, jealousy, and chaos. The storm that had started with Aote had now turned into an uncontrollable fire. Whenever Adaku or Aote tried to protest, Dan would wave them off, uninterested in their complaints. "Can't you see how she treats us?" Adaku would shout, but Dan wouldn't even look up. Aote, who had endured years of cruelty from Adaku, finally realized something important. If she wanted to handle Neka, she couldn't do it alone. The only way to defeat her was to team up with Adaku. Though Adaku had been her tormentor for years, they now shared a common goal: getting rid of Neka. And so, two former enemies became allies. They whispered in corners, planning their next move. They knew that if they didn't act soon, Neka would continue to dominate the household. Their plan was simple. They couldn't take down Neka alone, but together they stood a chance. They knew Dan too well. His eyes always wandered toward the young and beautiful. That gave them an idea. If they could find someone even more beautiful than Neka, Dan's attention would shift. He would forget about Neka, and she would lose her place as his favorite wife. One night. "We need someone he can't resist," Adaku whispered to Aote one night. Aote nodded in agreement. This was their only way. After days of careful thought, Aote remembered a woman she had seen in the village. Her name was Tashi, and she was exactly the type Dan adored. Tall, with skin as smooth and polished as clay, and legs that seemed to go on forever. Her sweet smile and gentle eyes turned heads wherever she went. "She's perfect," Aote said with a sly grin. Adaku's eyes lit up. They both knew that if Dan saw Tashi, his heart would leap, and he would quickly claim her as his wife. Their plan was set. Introduce Tashi to Dan, and just like that, Neka would be pushed aside. The balance of power would shift once again. The trap was laid together. Adaku and Aote approached Tashi with their plan. They showered her with gifts and promises, telling her that Dan would spoil her with riches if she agreed to be his wife. Tempted by the prospect of wealth, Tashi accepted without hesitation, and so the trap was laid. Tashi began spending time near the popular palm wine cellar, knowing that Dan would soon notice her. Adaku and Aote watched from a distance, certain that their plan would work and that Neka's reign in the household would soon come to an end. Just as they had predicted, Dan's eyes fell on Tashi one evening as she sat near the palm wine stall. Her tall frame, radiant skin, and soft smile caught his attention instantly. Dan's heart skipped a beat. Without wasting any time, he approached her. And within days, his mind was made up. Tashi would be his next wife. Dan married Tashi, and soon she was brought into the household as his fourth wife. Adaku and Aote watched with quiet satisfaction, their plan unfolding exactly as they had hoped. They knew Dan's heart would now be drawn to Tashi, and the power Nneka once held would soon slip away. The balance of power has shifted, but when Nneka heard the news, rage consumed her. Her face burned with anger. She couldn't believe Dan had taken yet another wife. She rushed to him, her voice trembling as she pleaded, "Dan, you don't need another wife. I am enough for you." Dan looked at her calmly and said, "Nneka, this is exactly how I married you too. Adaku and Aote were already here before you came. You got used to it, and so will Tashi." It felt like a heavy stone had been dropped into Nneka's chest. She couldn't believe how easily Dan dismissed her feelings. He didn't care. Just as he had married her while Adaku and Aote were still in the house, he had now done the same with Tashi. Nneka had no choice but to accept it. But deep inside, her anger boiled. Meanwhile, Adaku and Aote celebrated in silence, knowing that the balance of power had shifted once again. Tashi was now in the house, and it was Nneka's turn to feel the sting of being pushed aside. Day by day, Nneka's frustration grew as she watched Adaku and Tashi whispering, growing closer, and leaving her behind. Her mother's words made sense. Nneka felt like an outsider in her own home. Whenever Adaku and Tashi sat together in the evenings, sharing stories and laughter, Nneka sat alone, anger swelling inside her. She couldn't take it anymore. Desperate for comfort, she decided to visit her mother. Her mother listened quietly as Nneka poured out her frustrations, how Dan now showered all his attention and gifts on Tashi. "Mother, I can't stand it. He hardly even looks at me anymore," Nneka cried, but her mother remained calm. She stroked Nneka's hand gently and said, "Patience, my daughter. Remember why you married Dan in the first place. He's old. Soon enough, he'll be gone and all his wealth will be yours." Nneka nodded, trying to steady herself. Her mother's words made sense. She had never married Dan for love, only for riches. All she had to do was wait. All she had to do was wait. But waiting wasn't easy. Every day, Dan's attention toward Tashi grew. Gold earrings, necklaces, new clothes, gift after gift, while Nneka was left with nothing. Watching Tashi glow under Dan's love made Nneka's blood boil. She had been patient long enough, but deep down, she knew her time would come. For now, she would wait. Yet beneath her forced composure, her anger bubbled, ready to explode at any moment. It's Tashi's turn to cook one bright morning. It was Tashi's turn to cook for the entire household. Before the sun had fully risen, she was already preparing the meal. As the hours passed, the rich aroma of spices and herbs filled the air, drifting out of the compound and reaching the neighbors. Passers-by sniffed the air, pausing in curiosity. Was there a celebration happening? The scent was so mouth-watering that even the birds seemed to pause and enjoy it. Tashi had outdone herself. She prepared a soup so flavorful that by the time she finished, the entire household was buzzing with excitement. Wives, children, and even the servants sat eagerly, waiting to taste the meal. When it was finally time to serve, Tashi brought out steaming hot bowls of soup with fresh, soft swallow. The family gathered, their eyes shining with hunger. As they took their first bites, the air filled with praises. "Tashi, this is the best soup I've ever tasted," Adaku exclaimed, licking her fingers. "Yes. What's your secret?" Aote added, eyes wide with surprise. Even the children, usually picky eaters, ate until their bellies were full. Laughter and joy filled the compound, the meal turning into an unexpected festival of delight. Neka felt uneasy, but while everyone was enjoying the feast, Neka felt uneasy. She had noticed something odd. Dan, who was usually either chasing women or sitting around, hadn't been seen all morning. It wasn't like him to be so quiet, especially when the house was filled with such delicious food. The others continued eating and singing Tashi's praises. Neka's mind raced. Where is Dan? Normally, he would have been the first to eat. But his seat remained empty, his bowl untouched, and no one else seemed to notice. A creeping sense of dread crawled into Neka's stomach. Something wasn't right. Slowly, she pushed her bowl aside and rose to her feet, her heart pounding. She needed to find Dan. But as she stepped away from the gathering, a strange fear crept over her. Why hadn't anyone else noticed? Why did everyone seem so calm? With a tight knot in her throat, Neka knew she had to investigate. Something about this feast felt very, very wrong. Where's Dan? As the day wore on, that question echoed in her mind. Where was Dan? Dan won't be back. Dan's friends arrived at the house, their voices loud with excitement. They had planned a big party, one Dan would never miss. But today, he was nowhere to be found. They called out from the gate. No answer. Where's Dan? One of them asked, glancing at the house. The wives soon stepped out to greet them. Tashi, calm as ever, smiled and said, "He left early this morning. He won't be back for a while." Dan's friends exchanged puzzled looks. Dan, leaving without telling them it was unusual, especially today, on the day of a party. Still, they trusted Tashi's words and were about to leave when Neka, who had been quietly watching, stepped forward. Her voice was tense. "No, something isn't right." The air grew still. "He hasn't been seen all morning," Neka continued, her heart pounding. "We need to check Tashi's room." A heavy silence fell over the group. The other wives and Dan's friends exchanged confused glances. Tashi, still composed, tilted her head. "What?" she asked sweetly. "Why would Dan be in my room?" But Neka didn't back down. She couldn't explain it, but the uneasy feeling she had all morning had now grown too strong to ignore. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we need to look." Reluctantly, they followed her. Tashi's room. The air inside was thick. Too quiet. Neka's stomach twisted as her eyes swept the space, and then she gasped. Lying on the floor was Dan. His hands and legs bound tightly with rope, his mouth stuffed with cloth. Blood stained his clothes. The sight made everyone freeze in horror. But the most shocking part was what was missing. Dan's manhood had been cut off. A scream ripped through the room. Adaku and Aote stood like statues, their faces pale as death. Dan's friends rushed forward, untying him. But it was too late. His body was limp, his eyes barely open. The once proud, powerful man who had ruled over his wives, chasing women and living in luxury, now lay broken and bleeding. Tashi stood in the doorway. Her calm smile was gone. She didn't say a word as the horror unfolded in front of her. The house, once filled with laughter from the feast, had now turned into a place of fear and shock. And now, all eyes turned toward Tashi. The news spreads it wasn't long before the entire village knew. A crowd gathered outside Dan's house, their whispers filling the air. Inside, Tashi sat motionless. Her arms were tied, her face no longer calm. Everyone wanted to know why she had done something so terrible. And now, they waited for her to speak. Beyond imagination, silence stretched across the room. The villagers stood frozen, waiting. Then, Tashi finally lifted her head. Her voice was cold, but steady. "Yes, I did it." Gasps filled the air. "I cut off Dan's manhood." The crowd recoiled in shock, but Tashi did not flinch. "I couldn't take it anymore," she continued, her eyes blazing with anger. "Dan never stopped. One woman after another. Even after marrying me, he couldn't rest. Just yesterday, I saw him with another woman, holding her close. She was beautiful, young, and I thought, here we go again. Another one. Another woman he was planning to bring into this house." The villagers listened in horrified silence, hanging on to her every word. "I followed them," Tashi went on, her voice growing sharper. "I watched them together." He was laughing, touching her face. She clenched her fists, and I knew then he would marry her. Tashi took a shaky breath. "I wasn't going to let that happen. Not again. I wanted it to end. For good. If I cut off his manhood, he couldn't marry any more women. No more chasing, no more wives." "But then," Tashi's voice faltered, her cold fury wavered, her lips trembled slightly. I didn't know." A murmur spread through the crowd. "What didn't you know?" someone asked, their voice barely above a whisper. Tashi swallowed hard. The woman he was with, she wasn't another wife. She was his sister. A collective gasp erupted. Dan's sister. Not another woman. Tashi's eyes darkened. "I thought she was just another woman he wanted to marry," she whispered, the weight of her mistake crushing her. "I didn't know. I thought I was saving myself from being pushed aside. Again. Just like the other wives before me. So I planned to stop him. Once and for all." Then, suddenly, Tashi turned. Her sharp, accusing gaze fell on Adaku and Ote. But I wasn't the only one. All eyes snapped toward them. Adaku stiffened. Ote's hands trembled. "They were in on this too," Tashi spat. "They had their own plan. They wanted to teach Neka a lesson, so they came up with the idea. We should cut off Dan's manhood," they said. "That'll stop him. That'll make him stay home." But they didn't have the courage to do it themselves. So, I did. A deep, suffocating silence filled the air. The villagers turned, their eyes locked onto Adaku and Ote. Adaku, who was always proud and strong, looked small and afraid. Ote's lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. Guilt was written all over her face, Adaku's voice was barely a whisper. It was just talk. We never thought she would actually do it, but the truth was now laid bare. Tashi's jealousy and misunderstanding had driven her to commit the terrible act. And Adaku. And Otei's scheming had only made it worse. A mix of jealousy, betrayal, rage. And now, Dan's entire household lay in ruins. The villagers could hardly breathe. Tashi's confession hung in the air. And then, she spoke again. Her voice was ice cold. And the soup you all ate this morning. The words dripped from her lips like poison. The meat in that soup. It was Dan's manhood. A wave of horror swept through the crowd. Women screamed. Men staggered back in disgust, hands clutching their stomachs. Their faces twisted in revulsion as they realized what they had consumed. The once joyous feast, filled with laughter and celebration, had turned into a nightmare beyond imagination. Adaku, who had been silent, fell to her knees. The village stood frozen, in shock, in terror, and in the aftermath of the most chilling betrayal they had ever witnessed. Shattered by betrayal, the village stood in silence, a heavy, suffocating stillness, until a sudden shuffle. Tashi. And Adaku's fate had just been sealed, but Adaku saw her chance. She turned, hoping to slip away quietly to escape the villagers' wrath. But before she could disappear, a strong hand grabbed her arm. "Where do you think you're going, Adaku?" A voice rang out. Adaku froze. The crowd quickly closed in around her, their angry gazes burning into her. Her face went pale. Her hands trembled. There was no way out. I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she stammered, desperation cracking her voice. "It was just a moment of anger. I was so frustrated with Dan's endless marriages. I only suggested cutting off his manhood out of desperation. I never thought Tashi would actually do it." The crowd erupted in a wave of murmurs and disbelief. "So it's true," someone shouted. "You planned this." Adaku's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. "It was just talk. We were all angry, but I never wanted it to go this far," she cried. "I just wanted him to stop chasing women." But the villagers weren't convinced. The damage was done. Dan was dead, and it had all begun with Adaku's careless words and Tashi's cold actions. Oat stood silently to the side, her face filled with regret. But Adaku, she was at the center of it all. The whole village was stunned by the evil that had taken place within Dan's house. What started as a jealous scheme to get rid of one wife had spiraled into something dark and twisted. And now Adaku, the once proud, once feared woman, was caught in the very web she had spun. The villagers could hardly believe what they had just witnessed. The tale of betrayal, jealousy, and rage had reached its darkest point, and the weight of their actions fell heavily upon Adaku, Tashi, and the entire village. Dan's fate. Despite the villagers' efforts, Dan's injuries were too severe. He did not survive. His once powerful presence was gone, forever. His house, once filled with laughter and celebration, now stood in silence. Broken. Shattered. House of death and betrayal. The village elders. Beside the village elders gathered Tashi, the woman who had committed the unthinkable, Adaku, whose jealousy had fueled the crime, and Otei, who had stood silent, yet had played her part. The elders spoke for hours. When their decision was made, it was final. Tashi and Adaku would be banished. Forever. They could no longer live among the people they had betrayed. Their poisonous greed and jealousy had no place in the village. And though Ote had played a smaller role, she too had helped set the plan in motion. She too would be cast out. The banished women. The villagers gathered at the edge of the village. The three women stood before them. Their heads hung low. Their once proud faces were now filled with shame and regret. Adaku, once feared and respected, was now a shadow of herself, and Tashi, who had entered Dan's house with dreams of wealth and status, left with nothing. They walked forward, their steps heavy. With each step, they left behind their past lives. With each step, they moved toward an uncertain future. And then, they were gone. The aftermath. The village, still reeling, made one last decision. Dan's children, his only legacy, would inherit his home and wealth. Until they were old enough, they would be cared for by relatives. The house, once full of chaos, laughter, and betrayal, now stood quiet, a ghost of its former self, a place forever marked by tragedy. The story that lived. On, as years passed, the tale of Adaku and Tashi's betrayal spread far beyond the village. People whispered about it around fires. Mothers warned their daughters about the dangers of jealousy and revenge. Men told the story in hushed tones, reminding each other of the price of betrayal. Though time moved forward, the memory of that fateful day never faded. The once great Dan, brought down by the very women he trusted, became a ghost in the village's history, a warning, a curse, a story never to be forgotten.